Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let's see, we got a couple more people coming in. And well, my name is Tony Payan. I'm the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico here at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the halls of the Baker Institute. It's actually very nice to be back in person. I think it's one of our first events since before the pandemic, so it's kind of nice that we can travel and meet in person. I missed the workshops and the public meetings for so long. Many of us over time have been watching trends in international trade. Since I was a graduate student back in the 1990s, in the mid to late 90s at Georgetown University, there was a lot of enthusiasm. I remember doing the master's at the University of Dallas and the PhD at Georgetown and thinking international trade. And there was a lot of optimism in the 1990s about international trade. In fact, I remember checking a graph not very long ago, and there were a number of international trade agreements concluded in the 1990s. There have been a few over the decades in the post-war era, and all of a sudden in the 1990s, the graph just spiked. It was an era of great optimism. We do know and understand that international trade represents a major tool for countries, companies, and individuals' growth and prosperity. We know that, and indeed we can sing, I think, the virtues of freer trade all day and what it can do for us. Just yesterday at the workshop, I was mentioning that in Mexico, all those individuals who work for companies that are fully engaged in international trade have much higher income than those who are engaged in production for purely the domestic market, and certainly much better off than those that work in the informal economy. That's not a coincidence. But indeed, we can sing the virtues of trade all day. If only, however, it were that simple. We know that trade can create much dislocation and economic turmoil, and certainly stoke domestic politics in more somber directions. Trade is controversial. For one, it forces many who would otherwise feel comfortable in the economic dynamics of a domestic market to change and become more competitive. It tempts governments, of course, to distort trade flows to pursue advantages that they would not otherwise have, and it makes workers and publics worry about their own material prospects, as it makes them lose protections that they're used to enjoying, and involves, of course, the end of subsidies often, and on and on. The result is that we are left with a discussion that has little to do with trade and much more to do with politics. Yesterday during the workshop, it seemed to me, for those of us who are political scientists, that the discussion often turned away from the economics of trade into the politics that trade or freer trade often creates. And so this is where we are today, 25 to 30 years after that optimism of the 1990s, discussing trends in trade and wondering what the future of it will be. In effect, despite 25 years of the well-functioning North American Free Trade Agreement, now USMCA, as you know, we have seen hesitancy in the publics and politicians regarding free trade. That's certainly the case between the United States and Mexico today. We have witnessed how trade has been blamed for a series of issues that may have more to do with less than stellar public policies pursued by the governments than with trade itself. Donald Trump in the United States, for example, called the North American Free Trade Agreement the biggest scam ever worked on the American people. And López Obrador in Mexico was also an extreme critic of the North American Free Trade Agreement, although he finally realized the virtues of trade, or at least the dangers and the perils of ending it, and backed down from it. Both of these leaders blamed international trade for many issues that their governments have failed to address and that have little to do with international trade itself. And we see today that there is very little stomach for pursuing freer trade policies all around the world. Although I may say it seems to be a Western disease, because I see Asians and Africans, for example, pursuing freer trade with great gusto. And so I wonder, it may not be something that we see everywhere, but it's interesting that the world has different attitudes towards trade, and so this hesitancy is not present everywhere. Much of the political turmoil that freer trade can cause, for example, may end in policies, undesirable policies like beggar thy neighbor and populist politics. We see them today in both our countries, the United States and Mexico. And so the cycle begins again. We are at a watershed moment, though. We either push for taking advantage of what trade can do for us, or we revert to nationalistic policies that we know will cost much wealth and will compromise wealth production all around. So to discuss this, we hosted yesterday a workshop, as I mentioned, where experts discussed some of the key issues in international commerce from three key perspectives, and this is the challenge we gave them. The first was the implementation of the USMCA. How is that going? There were quite a few issues on the table, by the way, when it came to this particular topic, and some of them will be placed before you today. There was an interesting debate on the biggest elephant in the room as well, China, and its position in regard to the international economy and international commerce and what it means for all of us. And there was also some important discussion on the state of world trade in general and whether it is well governed. In the beginning, there were some of us who thought that international trade was not as well governed, and then by the afternoon, we heard a more optimistic perspective on the WTO and what it can do and what it really shouldn't do, but we expect it to do. And of course, there were some discussions on the apparent emergence of trade hesitancy all around the world. Although not by everyone. Canada, for example, is one exception, because it continues to be a country that is very clear-eyed on the fact that its own prosperity depends on open borders and well-regulated trade. Meredith Lilly, one of the participants in the workshop, said so. So here this morning, to conclude our activities for these 2 days, we have a discussion on what we can expect in the coming years, some of the issues with international trade, and we have a wonderful speaker this morning, and then followed by a panel of our workshop participants and experts. So let me introduce our keynote speaker this morning. I had not heard about Marc Levinson before. I just bought the book. This is my summer reading here. It's probably a couple of days of good reading. He's the author of the book, The Box, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. He will be accompanied by our Will Clayton Fellow on International Economics and Trade, David Gantz. After his presentation, both of them will come to the table, engage in a conversation, and engage you in conversation. And then after that, I'll come up and present our panel, which David will also moderate. Let me say something about our keynote this morning. I have his bio here. Let's see. Yeah, here it is. Marc Levinson is an economist, historian, and author living in Washington, D.C. Levinson spent many years as an economic journalist, including a term as finance and economics director of The Economist in London. He then joined the predecessor to J.P. Morgan Chase, where he created a unique industry economics function that married economic research with stock and bond analysis and developed a line of environmental research products for institutional investor clients. He later served as a senior fellow for international business at the Council on Foreign Relations. He has written for many leading publications and websites, including the Harvard Business Review, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and Foreign Affairs. His 7 books include the widely acclaimed history, The Box: How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller and the World Economy Bigger. And more recently, Outside the Box: How Globalization Changed from Moving Stuff to Spreading Ideas. Levinson earned a master's degree in public and international affairs from Princeton University and a doctorate in history from the City University of New York. We have copies of both books in the back table. If you want to have some summer reading, I think I recommend these 2 books highly. So without further ado, Marc, you're welcome to the Baker Institute.
Thank you, Tony, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. It's actually really nice to take a tie out of the closet, dust it off, try to remember how to tie it. It's been a couple of years, but it comes back. So it's good to be here in person, and I very much share those sentiments. I want to talk today about globalization, where it's been and where it's going, because right now there's a lot in the air about the death of globalization. I think it's a bit overwrought, but I think some historical perspective is useful in terms of what has happened with the world economy and how this is likely to play out in the coming years. It's helpful, I think, to understand globalization in historical perspective. I put the start of it really in the 1830s, roughly. There was a lot of trade before that, since forever, really. But this was the era of large-scale industrial capitalism. Trade started to grow very rapidly. International investment started to grow very rapidly, really from the 1830s up until 1914. This was the era in which British money financed American steel plants and American railroads. It was the era in which American cotton fueled the cotton mills of Lancashire. And so the world economy was quite intertwined. But there are a couple of things to think about with respect to this era of globalization. It was very much European-dominated. About 3/4 of world trade throughout that period was to, from, or within Europe. So it was not really global in that sense. And almost everything that was traded in that era involved commodities: copper, cocoa, coffee. There really was not much trade in manufactured goods. There really was nothing that we would think of as a supply chain in the modern sense. Now, people back in this period of what I call the first globalization were very optimistic about the effects of trade, bringing world peace. Countries that traded together would never fight one another, and so on and so forth. Well, we know how that story turned out in 1914. World War I began, international trade, international investment plummeted, and they stayed at very depressed levels through 2 world wars and a Great Depression. It was really only after World War II when the international economy started to grow significantly again. Here, the driving force was government. There was a deliberate effort during World War II, as you're probably familiar, to lower trade barriers among governments in order to promote international trade. This was not something that had really happened very much in the first globalization. There's a Houston connection, of course. One of the people who was very prominently involved in this effort was Will Clayton, whose name is attached to the chair that David Gantz now occupies. And this was very successful in boosting world trade. As tariffs dropped, trade grew very quickly. This was the era of petroleum trade for the first time. Super tankers arrived in the 1950s, and there was suddenly a new commodity in international trade. And there was more trade in manufactures. But it took until the late 1950s before manufactured goods accounted for a majority of the world's trades. Trade was still heavily commodity-driven, and it was still very much among the countries of what, to the end of this period, were called the North, the industrial countries, the developed countries. The other countries were considered the periphery, the South, the underdeveloped countries, the less developed countries. It's interesting to remember the politics of that period. The countries of the North were preaching how good international trade is, how it's great to lower your trade barriers and to open your borders. The countries of the South weren't so sure about that. They tended to regard international trade as being exploitative. The wealthy countries were buying their commodities on the cheap and selling them expensive manufactured goods in return. And so in this second globalization period, it was really the wealthy economies that promoted this, and the poorer economies that were quite suspicious of the virtues of international trade. This era imploded during the oil crisis of the late 70s and early 80s. And again, there was a dip in international trade in the 80s. And then something happened right around 1987. There was a big change in the pattern of trade. By the way, there was another Houstonian very much involved in these developments, the person after whom this school is named, James A. Baker, who was very much part of the movement to convince developing countries that one way to get out of their economic crisis was to trade more. And that really contributed to what followed. But there was a confluence of three technological developments in the late 1970s. In the late 1980s. One, about which I've written elsewhere, is the development of container shipping, which dramatically reduced the cost of shipping goods internationally and increased reliability. It just became a lot easier to send stuff internationally. Before the container came along, it was quite common for moving goods to take 15 to 20% of the value just in transport costs, and that really plummeted. So it became practical to trade a lot of things. Second, in the 1980s, telecommunications costs plummeted. Up until the late 1980s, most international communications among business were done by telex. I don't know if who is old enough to remember telex. I actually learned to operate a telex machine back in the day. You would sit down at a teletypewriter, type your message into a yellow tape, and then you would dial a phone number on a dial on the left side of the panel. And when the machine at the other end of the phone number picked up, you would run the tape through, and at the other end of the telephone line, a machine identical to the one you were on would go clackety, clackety, clack, and it would print out your message. That was a great way for communicating prices, volumes, things like that. It was a terrible device in terms of talking about business strategy. You really couldn't communicate business strategy. You couldn't monitor your business partners very closely over telex. And the decline in telecommunications costs actually made it easy and cheap to make an international phone call. We forget how much that has changed in recent years. And then the third thing happened, of course, was improved computing capacity, which made it possible for the first time to actually transmit data easily around the world. So what these three things did was make it possible for firms to think about organizing their businesses in different ways. They could construct international supply chains because they could keep track of what was going on across international supply chains. They could know what their subsidiaries or their business partners were doing in real time, halfway around the world. They could send information back and forth all day, and then they could get the goods moved reliably. And what resulted, starting in the late 1980s, was the creation of international supply chains. These were a totally novel development in the history of globalization. International trade grew about twice as fast as the world economy from the late 1980s until 2008. And almost all of that growth was in what economists call intermediate goods, stuff that's been partially processed here and is being sent somewhere else for further processing. Businesses could construct complex chains having this component made here and sent somewhere else to be inserted into a bigger component and sent somewhere else still to be assembled, and then have the final product be sent to the end market in yet another country. And these supply chains quickly became very, very complex. They had enormously positive effects for the world economy. They had some negative effects. I think Tony pointed some out, but it's also true that this really drew many of the emerging markets, as they were called at the time, into the world economy in a very positive way for the first time. You could not imagine the economic growth that has occurred not only in China, but in much of South Asia, in Korea, in other countries, without these kinds of supply chains. They really made it possible for many countries to participate in the world economy. And for the first time, it wasn't the case that all of this revolved around a handful of wealthy nations. Okay, the dynamics of international trade changed during this period. I call this the third globalization. Well, of course, the politics of international trade also changed somewhat. The wealthy countries that had been so gung-ho on trade during the second globalization weren't so sure anymore, because a lot of their manufacturing began to move to countries that had some comparative advantage, often lower wages or a bigger market or whatever it was. So they were not always so supportive of greater trade and investment now. On the other hand, many of the countries that historically had been very skeptical of international trade and foreign investment suddenly became very enthusiastic about it. The roles changed quite considerably. International trade really flourished during this period. And this is when it became common to be able to go into your local retail store and find goods that were made anywhere in the world. And it became common to have goods that actually didn't really have a national identity. They were partially made here and partially made there and assembled somewhere else. And people learned to accept that the world was operating in a very different way. In this world, imports and exports, as captured in the trade data, didn't really matter so much anymore. What people needed to think about more was value added. How much was a country and its workers contributing to the value of these final products? A very different way of looking at things, and a way of looking at things that many of our political leaders still quite haven't grasped. Well, the presumption was that this boom in trade was going to go on forever. Certainly that's what the folks in the container shipping industry thought. They started building these enormous, enormous vessels in the aughts, because they thought there would just be growth in trade at twice the growth rate of the world economy forever. That didn't happen. One reason it didn't happen was because these larger vessels made trade less reliable. Okay, these vessels took longer to load and unload. They overwhelmed ports when they arrived. And an international freight transportation system that had been really quite reliable became less so. Second, of course, we had the financial crisis in 2008, which really shook up matters, and trade dropped. Trade dropped quite significantly. International investment as a share of the world's output peaked in 2007. International trade as a share of the world's output peaked in 2008. Everyone involved thought that this was normal. This is what happens in a recession. Trade drops. The ship lines continued to build big ships in anticipation that there was going to be this huge pickup in trade. And it didn't happen. We were, in fact, at a point of transformation. After 2008, international trade in goods never regained the level that it had previously. International investment never regained the level that it had previously. Slowly but very clearly, globalization in these senses began to recede. There are a couple of reasons for this, I think. One is that the system had become less reliable. Another is that it began to occur to the firms that had built these long and complicated supply chains that they hadn't really priced in risk very well. Typically, the decisions about what to make where were very much dominated by bean counters. They said, okay, the labor is cheaper to produce this here, the transportation cost will be X on top, so let's make this here. And they didn't take into account the possibility that the stuff wouldn't get to where it was supposed to be when it was supposed to be there, that a factory might not be able to operate, that a retailer might not get its merchandise until after the Christmas sale. So firms themselves were retrenching from globalization in selective ways long before the pandemic came, just because once they calculated in the risks, some of what had occurred in the preceding quarter century really didn't make economic sense anymore. Once you attached a value to the possibility that your goods wouldn't show up, maybe it made sense to make stuff in different places or make it closer to home. And so we were already seeing the retrenchment from the most extreme forms of globalization. It's worth reminding everyone now that through early 2020, that is 2 years ago, the world trading system had an enormous surplus capacity. We had container ships sailing around the world half empty. We had ports which were in serious financial trouble because they didn't have enough merchandise coming through to pay the bills. We had ports that were merging because it was really the only solution to excess capacity. Okay. This changed very quickly with the pandemic. Why did it change? I don't think this has much to do with supply chains and really everything to do with macroeconomics. With the pandemic, governments around the world pumped a lot more money into their economies. Central banks pumped a lot more money into their economies. And at the same time, they told people that they couldn't spend on services. Okay? Travel was out of the question. You couldn't go out to a restaurant in many places. The theaters and concert halls were closed. So you had all of this money, and what could you do? You could buy stuff. And that's really at the root of what's been happening in the world economy now for almost 2 years. That's the source of these supply chain backups. There's some people who think that that's going to continue. And I suggest that these are people who, in general, have looked at their own order books, but perhaps not at the macroeconomic situation, because I think the macroeconomics point in a very different situation. We're headed into a significant economic slowdown, and guess what? People can buy services now. They don't have to buy goods. There's going to be less money around as central banks tighten around the world, and there's going to be more choice of things that people can spend it on. They can go to the movies. They can go out to dinner. They don't have to buy stuff. So I think this is going to lead to much slower growth in goods trade in the years ahead. On top of that, globalization is moving into a new phase for some other reasons, and I'd just like to point out 3 of them. One is that, I don't want to say anything to any of you personally, but we're getting old, okay? The average age in the United States is well up into the 30s. There are places in Europe where the average age is into the 40s. It's close to that in China. It's close to that in Korea. Well, older people don't buy as much stuff. Those of us who are of a certain age, we've got our furniture. Okay, we've got our clothes. We don't really want more stuff around the house. And think about the repercussions for that in the international economy. Older people, if you look at the consumer spending data, tend to spend a greater proportion of their incomes on services and a lower proportion of their incomes on stuff. And this is going to happen not only in the United States, but it's going to happen in much of the world, with the exception of Africa. We see similar population trends. The population bulge is at a different point in certain countries, but if you look all over Europe, all over Latin America, all over North America, and much of East Asia, you see this trend toward rapid aging of the average age in the population, which has to translate into lower consumption of lower growth in consumption of goods. The second thing that's happening is that technology is really beginning to affect the flow of trade, and it's going to do so in a very large way. We see this now. Most of us are probably sitting here with smartphones that have music on them. Okay? There used to be a significant trade in stereo systems. I remember when I went off to college and dragged speakers and record player and all that stuff, and vinyl as well. You don't need to trade that stuff anymore. Except for a few audio files, it hardly exists. Music has become a service, as well as many other things. And take a look at what's happening in the automotive industry. We seem to be moving very rapidly to electric vehicles. Well, the average electric vehicle, according to the data I've seen, has somewhere on the order of 2,000 fewer parts than the average internal combustion vehicle of similar size. Okay, that's 2,000 pieces of something that don't need to be manufactured and don't need to be shipped around the world. So these trends are going to have a very, very significant impact on trade flows. The third thing that I would point to is that production technology is beginning to make it possible to produce closer to home, basically. Things like 3D printing, which have been around for a few years, but they really started out as servicing niche markets, now are able to do sizable production runs. You can make stuff near where you want to sell it in many cases. Labor has been wrung out of the manufacturing process for most goods to the point that it's really not a significant competitive factor. You don't really have to make very many things in a place where wages are low anymore. There are other considerations, like how can I manage the supply chains and where are my customers, and those sorts of things. So it's not going to be necessary to trade some things that are now traded because you can make them closer to where those are used. What this means, in my view, is that we're going to have slower growth in international trade and goods in the years ahead. I don't think we're to the point that goods trade is going to retreat. I don't see a collapse here. But I do see that there's a lot of what I consider excessive optimism about the growth in goods trade in the world economy over the coming years. I think we're going to see a slowdown, and we're going to see goods growing significantly more slowly than the world economy rather than faster than the world economy. This reverts to the trend that was developing before the pandemic. Where does this leave us with globalization? We're really seeing a shift here because globalization in services is proceeding quite rapidly. Globalization in services is hard to talk about because, frankly, we don't know much about it. Okay? Some services are easy to measure. When someone buys an airplane ticket for an international trip, yeah, we got that. Okay? But some things are difficult or impossible to measure. The trade data that we have are based on transactions. So when a company in Houston sets up an operation in Mexico and it sends data back and forth to that operation, that is generally not going to show up in anybody's trade statistics. It just does not exist from the point of view of the statisticians because there's no transaction involved. Think about what happens when you go on to a website, and you can pretty much pick the website of your choice, your favorite Facebook page or whatever else you'd like. You are getting on that page a frame, a headline, a text, a photograph, probably several pieces of advertising, and it's entirely possible that each of those is put on your computer from a computer in a different country. We have no data on that either. Okay, that's trade too. Even though you are not paying for somebody to put that ad on your web page, it's an exchange of ideas. So we have this enormous growth in this sort of trade. I think we got some clarity about this actually with this outbreak of war in Ukraine. Who had imagined before this war began that Deutsche Bank, based in Frankfurt, employed a team of coders based in Leningrad to write software for its investment bank based in London? Okay. It's quite a normal business operation these days, and depending on how the company is organized, the work that these people do may well not show up into anybody's trade statistics. Meanwhile, we found that Ukraine turns out to be the world center of production of pharmaceutical molecules. So things so small you couldn't see them if you wanted to, that are being used by drug companies around the world to research and to manufacture new pharmaceuticals. Okay? Again, this is really very much an idea-based product. This is really not a manufactured product. The volume services trade is enormous, and it's going to continue to grow very rapidly, and we're going to continue to have no idea how much of it there is. This will continue to transform our world, I think. It's going to cause some problems for politicians because they can't point out how much there is. They can't identify who might be hurt by it, right? With goods trade, everybody likes to keep score, and they like to point out and extend a helping hand to the people whose factory has just been closed or whatever the situation. That's not something we're going to be able to do in this area of services. It's going to be much harder to figure out who's got a comparative advantage. And it's not clear what relevance trade policy is going to be. But I think there's one thing that is clear about this coming era of globalization. It's really going to depend very heavily on worker skills. Countries, we've seen some countries that are trying to wall themselves off from this. But the cost of walling a country off from the globalization of ideas is going to be very, very high, because the most talented people in your economy are not going to want to be in an economy that's walled off. They're going to want to be in a place where they can interact with other people who are engaged in producing similar services. There will be extremely serious repercussions, I think, economically for countries that try to wall off their services sectors. And so I think we're looking at a very different type of globalization in the years ahead. No, globalization is going away, not in the way that people are saying. We're seeing globalization of goods diminish in importance. We're seeing globalization of services burgeon. And that's the world we're headed into. It's going to be a very different world for all of us, and I think it's going to be a very interesting time discussing globalization as this develops in the years ahead. Thank you all very much.
Hi, Mark.
Okay. Okay.
David will jump in.
So you're comfortable sitting there?
Yep.
All right. Well, first I would like to express my own gratitude to Mark for his speech. I finished reading the latest book, Outside the Box, about a week ago, and I recommend it to you as Tony did. I don't know how many of you know about the earlier book, The Box, the focus on the history of the movement from moving goods in the holds of ships to putting them in 20 or 40-foot ocean containers. As a trade lawyer, I used to tell my students the GATT, the WTO, all of these trade agreements have had an enormous impact over the years in stimulating trade. But I said some economists believe that the movement toward containerization of freight had a bigger impact on expanding trade than all those lovely trade agreements by those lawyers out there who negotiated them. And I think there's probably is some truth to that, maybe a lot of truth to that. And as Mark mentioned, other things that have changed in recent years, the fact that communications has become almost zero in terms of costs, whether it's data or voice or something else, and the movement toward services. So what I'd like to do this morning, and we have plenty of time, is I have a couple of questions that are mostly a follow-up on some of the things that Mark was talking about, and then very quickly open it up to members of the audience who probably have questions they would like to ask, whether it's directly about the book and what he was talking about, or some of the other implications here. I mean, we're in Houston, a few miles from Mexico, and Texas-Mexico relations are a big issue for very good reasons around here. So start out with a very prosaic question. From what I can tell, companies like Maersk are still building huge container ships. They're ordering them, 15, 20,000 TEUs. That's a 20-foot unit. Are they making a big mistake?
Good question. Can everybody hear me here? Yep. Okay. The biggest container ships on the oceans these days carry more than 24,000 20-foot containers. That's as much cargo as 12,000 trucks. So they're quite large. There has been just this enormous leap in the size of ships as the ship lines pursue economies of scale. And of course, many of them have discovered that there are diseconomies of scale. That's part of the problem that the industry is facing today. You're seeing now an interesting division of opinion in the shipping industry. You've got some ship lines that are continuing to order ships like this, the kind that can carry 24,000 containers. These, in principle, will have the lowest costs to transport a container. If they're full, they will have the lowest greenhouse gas emissions per container, if they're full. Okay. Oh, and of great interest to the governments that subsidize their construction, they will use the most steel, which is why a number of governments are promoting these kinds of vessels. These ships, though, have a couple of problems. One is that if they're full is a pretty big reservation. It turns out that it's actually pretty difficult to, on a steady basis, come up with 12,000 containers on a weekly schedule to 12,000 40-foot containers on a weekly schedule to fill one of these vessels. They're very, very hard to keep filled. They cannot call at many ports. They require too much water, so you can't use them in all cases. And because they're so large and they require so much depth, they're not very flexible. As a result, many companies are now looking at smaller vessels. They're still large by historical standards, but we're talking about vessels that have a capacity of 14 or 15,000 TEUs rather than 25. A vessel of that size could come into probably any major port in the United States, whereas a 25,000 TEU vessel could call at very few ports. It could be unloaded at almost any port. And if business is lousy, they could be changed from route to route pretty easily. And so we're going to see who wins here. We're going to get a market test of whether it's the guys who are buying the biggest vessels, who are going to have a real struggle to keep them filled, or the guys who are buying vessels are actually somewhat smaller than the ones they've been buying most recently, but may have slightly higher operating costs per container, but have a lot more flexibility and a lot better ability to manage risks.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, using the auto industry as an example, for example, it's 25% of the trade in USMCA between the US, Mexico, and Canada, and it produces millions of jobs in all three countries. The auto industry experienced a bit of a problem back with the tsunami 10 years ago in Japan. And there were many of us who thought that they would move from just-in-time manufacturing, the bean counters, to just-in-case and diversify perhaps their sources. They didn't. And now, of course, they are going through a chip shortage of their own making to some extent. Do you think it's going to be different now in the future?
To some degree, many of the auto companies have started, here's a blast from the past. Many of them are vertically integrating, okay? This is something that the auto companies did 100 years ago, okay? When they made cars, they had to make all of the components for their cars. And then over time, particularly since the 1990s, they got rid of most of that stuff. The auto companies focused on assembling cars, and they sold everything else. They sold, GM spun its parts business off to Delphi, and Ford spun its parts business off to Visteon, and other companies did similar sorts of things. And the car companies became simply designers and assemblers. They didn't actually make most of the stuff that was in the car, except for the engine and the transmission in most cases. That is now reversing. They're taking more direct control over their production. They see that they made a mistake here. What is interesting with respect to electric vehicles is that they are actually regarding their control over the technology, over the design of the semiconductors, over the design of the batteries, as a competitive advantage. They don't want to farm that out to somebody. They want to keep that in-house because they see this as something that will differentiate themselves from others. How companies are dealing with their supply chains otherwise, I think, varies somewhat from manufacturer to manufacturer, but you're seeing a lot of concern about resiliency. I would just point to the current situation of the auto industry in Europe, where despite what's going on in Ukraine, they really have not lost production. They were able pretty quickly to move production from plants in Ukraine, these are parts plants, not assembly plants, to other places in Europe and keep their assembly lines churning. And so I think there's been some success at risk management.
Thank you. I think it's going back to a little bit, I'll do this one more question, then I'll open it up. The Federal Maritime Administration has been listening to agribusiness and farmers and is apparently trying to address a perceived problem where many shipping companies would rather take empty containers back to China and Asia rather than grain-filled containers. And it looks as if Congress will pass legislation which gives the FMA some control over this practice. Do you think that's a good idea for them to be getting back into this aspect of the business, or is it going to be adverse?
I'm not sure how much the Federal Maritime Commission can do here. You know, one of the things that they're being asked to do in some of this legislation, here's another blast from the past. They're being asked to do some of the sorts of things that the Interstate Commerce Commission used to be asked to do when it looked very deeply into individual companies' practices. And it would say, you know, this practice is unfair, or this practice is reasonable, or issue an order describing how the practice should be changed. And I'm not talking about the rates that everybody's familiar with. I'm talking about the nitty-gritty details when some shipper or some other railroad would protest that this particular practice was unfair. That's somewhat what the Federal Maritime Commission is being asked to look at. For example, with respect to demurrage. Demurrage is a cost that is charged when your container or your rail car or whatever is kept for more than it's supposed to be kept. In this case, when it sits in a container yard rather than being removed and emptied. Well, every container that's sitting in a container yard, just like every freight car that hasn't been returned quickly, has a story behind it. Okay, something went wrong somewhere. The Interstate Commerce Commission used to hear those stories and used to make wise judgments about which story was valid and which wasn't. And the Federal Maritime Commission is going to have to be in the same position. Did these people have a legitimate reason for leaving their container in the yard for too long before taking it to the warehouse, or did they not? I don't envy them that task. It's really getting into the most mundane aspects of business, and I suspect that they're not real enthusiastic about doing it.
Probably right. All right. How about some questions from the audience? Just stand up and speak loud enough so that Mark can hear you, and we'll move forward. I have more, but I will wait. Dan.
You discussed the trade in goods. You made some mention also to trade in services. But there's also the trade and investment, that is foreign direct investment, in which multinational companies set up operations overseas in the form of subsidiaries and in joint ventures. And there's also trade in technology, which is, trade in intellectual property, the assignment and the licensing of intellectual property rights. And the trade and investment has been, until recently, really there's been a sharp increase in the trade and investment and expansion of multinational companies since really the end of the Second World War. Now, there's been a downturn recently, but I suspect that is still going to be a very strong channel of trade. And then, of course, the trade in technology is increasing. So you didn't really discuss those two other channels of trade. What is your view on how that will either accelerate or affect globalization?
Good question. I think that the reason that international investment in this way has been relatively weak for the past dozen years is that firms have found they don't really need it. There's been such a development of contractual relations internationally and such an increased ability to monitor contractual partners that you don't actually need to make the investment anymore in many cases. The reason for investing in the first place is because you want control, but you also want to be able to monitor what's going on in that other country. And these days, many, particularly in manufacturing, many manufacturers are monitoring in real time what their suppliers are doing. Their suppliers are at arm's length from them, so they don't actually have to have a subsidiary on the scene anymore. And I think that's one of the things that's driving the changed preferences for international investment. But I'd be interested in your thoughts.
But of course, a country like China will not permit multinational companies to simply have contract manufacturing, is what we'd call it in the legal field, but would require foreign direct investment in certain areas. So there's certain areas, for example, you must send capital to China and to establish a business entity in China. So that, of course, is one of the largest, if not, I think it's the second largest market for foreign direct investment. So China does not permit companies to do that, but requires them to come into China and to make a capital investment. So that, I think, at least in the case of China, is not currently the case.
Mm-hmm. That's true, although in China, many of those investments have been joint venture type investments. I think that the trends, from my perspective, a lot of these trends in international investment are related to the more general critique of financialization of the economy. Many companies have been criticized, not least by investors, for having too many assets. They've been urged to become more asset light. One way you do that is by having somebody else own the assets. And I think that's part of what's been going on here. Whether we see a reversion to more asset-heavy management is an interesting question. I don't know, I'm quite fascinated by the fact that the paragon of the online company, Amazon, has become one of the most asset-heavy companies in the world. So I think we may be seeing some more transformation, but I do think that there's a possibility that there may be a shift back here. To your point on intellectual property, yes, this trade is growing and is going to continue to grow very rapidly. I think all of those of us who had the pleasure of watching Midnight Diner on Netflix during the pandemic, a Japanese comedy that we would never have come across except that we had to stay home and needed something to do. There's a lot of movement of copyrighted property now internationally. People are accustomed to it. It's interesting to me that people like to have the choice, but they don't necessarily prefer the foreign product once they have the choice. There's some evidence that people actually prefer to listen to music in their own language, for example, even though they can have a streaming service that will serve music in 50 languages. But they do have that option, and I think that's very much a part of people's standard of living today, to have access to these to international intellectual goods.
I have two questions I'd like to ask. Number one, it seems to take an inordinate time to get decisions through the WTO. What can be done to speed that up? And then once the decisions are made, for the countries to live up to the decisions of the WTO. And what can the United States and Japan learn from not having a decent guest worker program compared to the German model of guest worker program?
On the WTO question, I think I'm going to defer to some of the people in the room here who are much more conversant with the WTO appellate process and so forth than I am. This is an international organization with, I don't know, was it 142 members or whatever the most recent number is. And I think it would be astonishing if anything moved quickly, but that's just a personal and slightly cynical view. Go ahead. And we may have other people who want to intervene on that point.
Go ahead for the second.
Yeah. In terms of the guest worker situation, I don't know any country that's ended up doing this happily. I mean, every country has had its ups and downs with guest workers. Some have absorbed them somewhat more easily than others, but whether a guest worker program would be more successful here, I don't know. The ones I'm familiar with in Europe are not necessarily things that I would recommend for the United States, and I don't know that Europeans necessarily consider them to have been all that successful.
Do you want to fuss with the other one, or shall I?
I was just going to say it's something I'll talk about on the panel in a few minutes.
Okay, yes, let's defer, and Simon Lesser will answer the question as part of the panel.
Good morning. So earlier in your talk, you said that international trade in the early days was primarily on commodities, like minerals and things of that nature. And global trade started with manufacturing and services. But commodities remain an enabler to produce manufactured goods as well as some services like energy, minerals, etc. How do you see the future of where the commodities are basically regional located or imbalance in the world? In the future, how does that impact the international trade?
Okay. One reason that commodities have accounted for a declining share of international trade is that over the long term, commodities prices have generally fallen. And the demand for certain commodities has not grown so much. I think that there's a lot of attention now to control of commodities, and we're seeing that in industries such as the motor vehicle industry, where individual firms are very concerned about their supply of commodities that are needed to manufacture their products. And so there will continue to be, I think, robust trade. I don't think bulk shipping is going to go away anytime soon. But we're seeing efforts to regionalize that in certain commodities. Certainly not all commodities, and some commodities, particularly agricultural ones, it may not be practical to regionalize those. It's going to be very difficult to grow a drinkable cup of coffee in Europe. But we're seeing very significant efforts in the United States and some efforts in Europe to have commodity production alongside production in Africa or Asia or Latin America, just to have alternative sources of supply. I look at this really through the lens of resilience, and we're seeing, obviously governments talk about that, but we're also seeing major manufacturers who are very concerned about the sources of commodities in their supply chains, and they're looking for alternatives.
Good morning, and thank you for being here. When you wrote the box, you looked back at a technological change that was really fairly simple, the locking mechanism that allowed containers to be moved from one mode to another. Put your future-looking hat on. If a container ship comes into Houston, for example, and relatively small, 6,000 boxes come off that ship, if half of them are going to Dallas, Fort Worth, then that's 3,000 trucks on the road. What technology do you see in the future that's going to allow this trade to continue, or is there going to be one, or will we stifle on the land side operations that serve those ports?
It's a great question. I think that the ports in the United States are somewhat hampered in dealing with this. The ports in the United States, or the terminals in the ports, depending on the situation, have very little control of what goes out the port gates. This is in marked contrast to the situation in Asia or in Europe. Just to give you an example, when Antwerp, to pick a port, or Rotterdam, same story, wanted to expand, wanted to build new container terminals in the port, the respective governments said, you cannot do that if this means more truck traffic. You come up with a plan to get a certain percentage of containers out of these terminals on water, either by barges or by what they call short sea shipping. And the ports were able to take charge of this and require the ship lines to organize their trade in this way, so that when a vessel comes into the port of Rotterdam, a large percentage of the cargo immediately gets loaded onto barges and shipped up the Rhine. Okay? A port in the United States would not be able to do that. It cannot control anyone's choice about whether to use a truck or a train or a barge or how it's going to get the container out of the port. It cannot coordinate all these private actors. And this has been a very sensitive issue in the United States. As I'm sure most of you know, there are a gazillion trucking companies in the United States, many of them with a single vehicle and a single driver and a single owner. And all of those people want the ability to compete in any branch of the business, including hauling containers to and from ports. So it's not possible for a port to say to a shipper, you can't use these guys, you can only use a big company that's going to minimize the air pollution from your trucks, or you have to put these on trains. So there's a real coordination problem in the U.S. ports that I think may not be readily solved. A coordination problem that I think has been dealt with better elsewhere. This does not really apply to Dallas too much. There are a few experiments in the United States of what they call marine highways. So the idea is that the containers come into a big port and then they're put onto a barge and taken up or down the coast. Those generally have not worked out terrifically either because they're reliant on a regular flow. If the barge is going to take 20 containers up the river and then come back empty, that's not a viable proposition. And again, it's been proven very difficult to coordinate this sort of traffic. The one thing I've seen that is encouraging, and I don't know specifically about the Texas situation, but there are a number of ports that have established what are known as inland ports. Okay, here the containers come into the port. Many of them are put immediately onto trains that travel relatively short distances to distribution hubs. So they're not traveling clear across the country, they're traveling maybe 150, 200 miles. And you see this in upcountry South Carolina from the port of Charleston. You see this in Front Royal from the port of Norfolk, Virginia. And that gets at least some of the truck traffic out of the port area and shortens the truck journey. But that's very definitely done on a market basis. It has to be made financially attractive to the individual shipper to do. The terminal operator can't mandate that.
Thank you. Actually, your response connects very well to my question. There is a lot of push right now for companies to reduce their carbon footprint. And one of the areas where we see that carbon emissions are still high, it's precisely the trucking industry, shipping, and the trains. How do you see the transition to reducing the carbon footprint affecting all of these supply chains in the industry?
I think it's different in different industries, different segments of the industry. In the container shipping industry, there's a lot of interest in trying to reduce emissions with lower emitting ships. It's very difficult to do this by fuel substitution because by the nature of the industry, if you're going to switch to a different fuel, you have to have it available in large volume in every major port in the world. So most of the work that's being done in this area is actually being done in Europe involving vessels that ply relatively short routes, okay? A ship that goes from a port in Scandinavia to a port in Germany and back again. There it's easy to have ammonia or some other fuel at both ends, and the ship line can be assured that there will always be supply of fuel. But it's much harder to do when you've got your vessels roaming all around the world. And so far, at least, the fuel supply chains don't exist very well. What's going to happen in the industry, in the maritime industry, is that the ships are likely to be steaming even slower. Ships generally steam more slowly now than they did 20 years ago. And that's going to get even more so. This effectively raises costs for shippers in several ways. It basically reduces capacity in the industry. It takes containers out, it takes ships out because just completing any voyage takes longer, so a ship will be able to haul fewer containers over the course of the year. So by effectively reducing capacity, it gives the ship lines more control over pricing, which the ship lines like very much. Slow steaming means that there are going to be higher costs for crews on the vessels because they're going to spend more time on the vessel for each voyage, higher mortgage payments because each vessel is going to be in use for more days each time it goes to sea. So that'll raise costs, and then inventory costs are going to go up because remember, it's the shipper that owns this cargo while it's in transit. Inventory costs haven't mattered much to anybody for the past few years with interest rates at zero. They're not zero anymore. And so here's another cost it's going to raise costs for shippers. So I think this is actually going to further discourage globalization in goods trade. The railroads, I think, are making some progress here. Again, there's technology in Europe, mostly hydrogen, to deal with the emissions from the trains. There's a lot of interest in electrification, but electrifying rail systems at least from what I know, does not generally work very well with double-stack trains. So the trains that carry cargo in Europe, and there are a lot of them, but they're a lot smaller, a lot shorter than U.S. freight trains, and they're just one level high. They're not double-stacked, so they're not as efficient in terms of moving the cargo. And then trucks are the wild card. Is there actually a viable technology that will reduce emissions from trucks? People don't seem to think that we're actually going to be having battery-powered long-distance trucks very soon, because that's not really, the battery would be too heavy for the vehicle, would not necessarily be efficient. Will fuel cells actually become economically practical for long-distance trucking? I don't know the answer to that, but that's the sort of thing people are looking at. So some of these conundrums really have not been resolved yet.
I have a question, Mark. It's kind of a broad question because your presentation kind of raises some issues about the future. I mean, you cannot avoid thinking about the future as you see these trends, and since you're a historian, maybe you can see the future as well as the past. So I have it seems to me that in your remarks there is a tension, or a couple of tensions that I'd like you to comment on. One of them is this idea of ally shoring, near shoring, reshoring that is going on. Those of us who travel to the U.S.-Mexico border, for example, have seen a boom in the maquiladora industry right up against the border. So there's something going on in terms of coming back from China or other places and trying to locate, but it's still less expensive so that you can use less expensive labor in Mexico, but just worry about the last mile to the border and in, and then on. And so I wonder how that fits in there, and if this is not part of something that might that you suggested in your presentation, which is kind of a Balkanization of trade, where these large powers like China and the U.S. will simply retract to regional chains, this kind of organization of the world economy and trade around regions, and what that means for the future. But I would add another question, and that is, what about automation, mechanization, robotization, and what does that mean for the very things that I suggested in the beginning, which is the politics? I mean, jobs. And you mentioned service industry or trade in services and technology and ideas and on. So jobs will, as automation proceeds, be lost. And what about the political turmoil that this will bring? Because you and I may be able to go to the theater and movies and buy music, but not everybody will. And so this is going to create some serious political issues. And I wonder what that means for the future of capitalism itself. I mean, what are the moving sands here that you can see that we need to anticipate as policy students and policy makers?
That's a bunch of questions. Okay, let's start off with nearshoring or whatever. I'm a bit concerned that some people conflate domestic production with resilience. If you take a look at what the Council of Economic Advisors recently published, for example, in its economic report of the president, that yearly thing that it does, there's a chapter in there on supply chains. It was published a few weeks ago. And it makes the assertion that buying American or government procurement rules can make supply chains more resilient. Well, by itself, buying American doesn't make a supply chain more resilient. Okay. What makes a supply chain more resilient is having options, is having choices, is having alternatives. And so if you've taken something out of a factory in another country and put it all in a factory in California, you're still, and there's an earthquake, your production is going to be interrupted. Okay? The way to solve that is to have production in multiple places and have flexible supply chains. I think that, by the way, this has worked pretty well In the shipping industry, this is one reason that the Port of Houston has grown so well on the container side, I think, is because of many companies that had previously shipped through the West Coast, from Asia through the West Coast, decided they simply needed to hedge their bets. Okay, not any great love for Houston, just it's not really smart to have all your shipments going through Los Angeles. And so maybe it's a smart strategy to take some of them and send them to Houston and some of them to New York, just in case something goes wrong. And I think very much the same thinking is coming into production. The question about the production in Mexico is how much of the supply chains are actually moving in that way, because if what we've got in Mexico is simply plants that are assembling goods that are produced in one place abroad, then it's still not a resilient supply chain. You may be able to source the finished product from Nuevo Laredo, but the components in the finished product are still coming from one place here or one place there, and if something goes wrong, the supply chain will be interrupted. So I'm not sure that by itself is sufficient resilience. It does tie in, though, to your second question about this regionalization, which I think is a very strong trend in certain manufacturing industries, not in all of them, but in some of them. And I think you do see that a number of major companies really would like to be able to produce a lot of their products within a particular region and basically have redundant production somewhere in the European area, somewhere in East Asia, and somewhere in the Americas. This involves a lot more than opening a manufacturing plant. It involves, to the question about commodities, it involves where you get the commodities, and it involves where all the components are made. But I think you see, especially in the auto industry, but you're starting to see that in other industries, that companies are pursuing this approach. In terms of automation, you know, an awful lot of people who work in factories these days are actually not involved with production. We tend to have this image, which is really, you know, a 1950s image of all these people working on the factory floor. But most factories don't have very many people working on the floor. They use machines for that. And there may be people who are there maintaining the machines with very high skill levels. There may be people who are there to troubleshoot problems, which happen with disturbing frequency when you've got all these machines. And there's certainly people engaged in other parts of the process, but they're not turning wrenches and screwdrivers very much. I think automation is really going to take care of a lot of that. On the other hand, I think that people are much more cognizant of the shortcomings of automation. No less an authority than Elon Musk has admitted publicly that Tesla invested too much in automation, and that there are some types of jobs for which humans are much better suited because they can be more flexible. They can take other actions if something goes wrong, whereas a machine may not be able to. So I don't think these jobs are going to go away, but I think it's long past the point at which manufacturing employment was a source of growth in jobs. People like to wave this around, we're going to create more manufacturing jobs, but I don't really see that happening to any great degree. I think, by the way, and I mentioned this in our workshop yesterday, that I think this is an issue for Mexico, much more than for the United States. Mexico has bet very heavily on manufacturing and on a manufacturing workforce. And I think the trends on automation are going to be just as important in Mexico, which is why I think it's so important for Mexico to think about how to capture higher value jobs in the manufacturing process and not simply assembly jobs, because over time many of those assembly jobs will go away. The decline in manufacturing labor has been a worldwide phenomenon. It's not limited to the United States, and sooner or later it'll get to Mexico. Yeah.
Any others from the audience? Well, just to follow up on the discussion you just went through, Somebody said that in the morning yesterday, people were very pessimistic and they became more optimistic in the afternoon, and I was one of the ones who was very pessimistic in the morning. But following up on that and what you said, there is a theory, particularly those of us who are lawyers and involved in international trade organizations like the WTO, that with the WTO becoming less and less, shall we say, relevant to developing new trade rules, and certainly irrelevant at this point to resolving disputes, plus some of the things you were talking about earlier, the regionalization of supply chains, it seems to me, ties into the regional trade organizations. And I guess my question, and I will get to it, is that at the moment, you have 2 out of 3 presidents in North America, Lopez, Obrador, and Biden, who basically couldn't care less about North American integration. Canada, of course, is different. But are they future governments in both countries? If this trend continues, are they going to be forced to take more interest in USMCA just as defense against Europe and Asia? Or do you think that's irrelevant?
I don't think that they see USMCA as a huge factor at this point. I mean, I think that there's a lot of trade going on without respect to USMCA. I think that there's much more concern about demand than about the regulation of trade. So I think we're seeing, in general, a lot of ad hoc arrangements around the world, and I think we're going to see more, particularly in some of these intellectual property areas where the idea of negotiating a WTO-type agreement that has any teeth is just not practical. And so we're going to see agreements among a smaller group of countries that are willing to actually provide some serious enforcement and agree to that. And there will be, depending on which countries do that, there's going to be a lot of pressure, internal pressure in other countries to participate in these kinds of things. Because if you are a developing country and you've got a bunch of technologically inclined people who've just graduated from your university, they want to find jobs in high technology. And they're not going to be able to do it if their country is not participating in these agreements that deal with technology and with intellectual property. So they're going to have the pressure from within to be part of this. So I think we're probably going to see this more as a US, Europe, Japan thing initially. But I think it's going to pull in countries, not because the rich countries are demanding it, but because people in the developing countries are demanding it.
Okay. Just to slightly follow up on that, and then we'll have to quit. Some have been critical of the Indo-Pacific economic framework because once it gets filled out, and we're still waiting for that from the administration, it's going to focus on things like digital trade and the relationship between presumably digital trade and services and intellectual property. And some of us have said, well, unless you're willing to deal with market opening and that, it's not going to work. But from what you're saying, maybe that's a smart approach of the future. And obviously, this particular one is Asia, but doesn't mean there's also a technology council with Europe. So obviously, something that there are people in the Biden administration who think this is really something like the wave of the future, and it's an advantage that the unions aren't opposed to it yet. Do you think maybe they're on the right track? What do you think?
Well, I think there's some companies for whom these kinds of agreements are really important. Okay, take an international accounting firm. I mean, it wants to set up formal partners/subsidiaries in every country, and it wants to be able to move things around among them, and it needs some kind of protection to be able to do that. But there are a lot of aspects of the economy for which these kinds of agreements probably are not all that relevant. And I don't think that they necessarily have to be a priority. I mean, one thing that you see with trade negotiators is that they're always looking for something to negotiate. Those of you who, this phrase isn't much used anymore, but this used to be called the bicycle theory of trade. that you had to keep peddling, generating new trade agreements, or else the bike would fall over and you'd fall off. And I don't know how applicable that is anymore. I think you're seeing ad hoc solutions to many of the critical trade problems that may in some ways be preferable. Yep, they're discriminatory, which has been a bad thing since, 1947? And they are in some ways inefficient, as any economist would tell you, by showing the cost of inefficiency on a curve. But I think they may actually be superior in terms of achieving certain kinds of objectives.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Then Tony, you want to? Okay, well, thank you again, Mark. We really appreciated it.